Hi everyone, my name's Andrea Coomber and I have the great privilege of being the Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform. And I'm delighted to invite you, or to welcome you, to the first of the Howard League Spotlights events for 2023. Today's event is about the persistence of the Victorian prison. As we know, about a quarter of people in prisons in this country are in Victorian prisons and they bring their own challenges. And I'm really delighted to have a great panel with a variety of experiences of Victorian prisons for you today. First of all, a few housekeeping matters. This event is being recorded, the whole event, so please just bear that in mind. And it will be circulated to those people who have emailed us this morning saying they can't make it, and will be put on our website. We have presentation and then some responses, and we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll take questions from you. So please put your questions into the Q&A box. At these events, you would all have been to them before, but it always seems that questions are slow at the beginning, and then by the end, just as we're coming to the end, there are millions of questions. So please, first in, best served. And finally, an apology, a strange apology from me, which is at some stage I'm expecting a delivery that I cannot avoid, so I will have to nip out, but I will, hopefully it will be well timed. So let me introduce our panel for today. We're really thrilled to have Professor Dominique Moran, who is Professor of Carceral Geography at the University of Birmingham, and is the project principal on this project between Bath and Birmingham about the persistence of Victorian prisons. And we're really pleased that Dominique's going to share her research with us. The Howard League is a proud partner in this project, which is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and we look forward to hearing more about the project and its findings today. We're also joined by two people who know prisons from a different perspective. One is Ian Blakeman, who is I think a veteran, it's fair to say, of our English prisons with nearly 30 years service in the prison service, including being a governor of a number of prisons, currently HMP Pentonville on the Caledonian Road. We also are pleased to welcome one of our own staff, Lee Brown, who works in operations at the Howard League, and himself spent some time in Victorian prisons. So they'll bring different perspectives to the questions at play today. But first of all, we're going to hear from Dominique. Do you want to unmute yourself, Dominique? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen, which everyone says before everything goes wrong, so hopefully it won't. Well, so thank you very much for the invitation. As Andrea said, I'm the principal investigator of this research project, which has been ongoing now for a couple of years, but we haven't yet completed. So I'm going to be sharing some interim findings with you. And as the title of the event suggests, we're looking at the persistence of the Victorian prison, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. But just for sort of full disclosure and to acknowledge all the people that I'm working with, the full research team is there on the slide. So in this project, as Andrea indicated, we're interested in the continued operation of Victorian-era prisons. So we're asking really how and with what implications and why do these institutions continue to run now? And I suppose as a sub-question, how will we know, how will we be able to recognise when perhaps they've reached the end of their functional lives? Now, important to say that in this project, we're not advocating for one thing or the other. We don't have a particular position, especially on that last question. We're more interested in just understanding what life is like in these prisons now, and particularly the way in which their history influences how they run now. So just to give you a bit of background, and I suppose to give a bit more information to the things that Andrea was talking about just at the beginning, about 1 in 4 of the custodial population of men in England and Wales are currently in 32 prisons which have Victorian-era accommodation in them. So they weren't necessarily all first built during the Victorian period, but they had accommodation coming from that time in them. Most of these prisons are local, which means that they serve the local courts. And that means that most imprisoned men will at some time have spent time in one of them. There have been, as I'm sure that everybody on this call knows, various media reports over the near and the more distant past, which have described the continued operation of these prisons as scandalous, and which have urged them to be torn down and presumably replaced with something better, or indeed not replaced at all. These critiques are not just recent. As early as 1922, so over 100 years ago, it was being argued that the only reform to which the buildings can usefully be subjected is dynamite. So this is there's been some strong views held about these prisons for quite a long time, and yet, as we know, the Victorian infrastructure remains an integral part of the prison estate. So just to give you a bit of information about the research project that we've been doing, the kind of things which that's involved. We've been running this project for about 2 years now, and it has 2 case study prisons. So not Pentonville, unfortunately, but we've worked at Lincoln and Liverpool. In the first year of the project, which was the first COVID year, we largely focused on doing historical research and speaking on Zoom and on Teams and so on to collect some oral histories from people who've previously worked or been incarcerated in Victorian-era prisons. And much more recently, we've done field work at these 2 case study sites, speaking to a lot more than 100 people across the 2 sites, and also doing some creative methods, so encouraging people to respond to the kind of questions that we have in the project through poems, writing, artwork, and so on. And as you see there in this kind of project plan, there's various ways in which that work will come to the public eye. So we're just over halfway through the research project, and for that reason, I suppose what I'm able to do in this seminar is to share some interim findings. So these are not completely thought through, these are indications out of our data, but the kind of questions, I suppose, that we're finding are coming from the research and the kind of things that I thought might be of interest to share. And these, I suppose, insights come from the 5 broad research questions that have driven the work. So we've asked, firstly, how has the fabric of Victorian prison buildings changed over time? How they function today, what it feels like to live and to work in these prisons, and I suppose how that's changed over time. This question about the cultural framing of the Victorian prison is probably something that I don't have time to get into very much in my presentation, but I'd be more than happy to talk about it afterwards. This is more about how important the Victorian prison is in shaping what people generally, and I suppose especially people who've not had lived experience of prison, what they think of, and in terms of what prison is for and what it's like. And then finally, we're interested in what the fallout of the continued operation of the Victorian prisons are, why it matters, what difference it makes. So I'll take these questions one by one. So in terms of the fabric of Victorian prisons and how they've changed over time, in one sense, they've changed massively. There's been extensive changes to these buildings. The original wings have been extended lengthways, sideways, upwards. There have been new buildings constructed within quite tight urban sites of many of these prisons, new wings completely, workshops, gyms, and so on. And of course, internally, in the accommodation areas, there's been extensive retrofitting of sanitation. Interestingly, some of these prisons were built with integral toilets in the cells to start with, and those were then taken out again and then put back in again, much later on. There's been retrofitting of different kinds of light, first gas light and then electric light, trunking which goes along with that, wiring, netting stretch across the voids of these prisons in between the landings, plumbing, fire systems, showers, and so on. So enormous amount of change inside, and indeed, if you go into one, you can see the ways in which these sort of cables and pipes and so on have been kind of fitted to the walls. In a more structural sense, lots of these prisons have had new windows, new roofs, new flooring, new railings, new staircases, and indeed new cell doors. However, these changes to the prisons are not just recent. So almost as soon as they were completed, particularly our 2 case study prisons were being changed. So their drainage never worked, and in some cases still doesn't work. And very, very early on, changes were made to these prisons in order to enable them to house more people than they had been intended to. So they were supposed to have 1 person per cell, man or woman. Very, very early on, they had 2 in these cells, and they were expanding cells into the basements to create more space. So there's been change in these prisons for quite a long time, which means that very little of the original fabric of the buildings now remains, apart from the bricks, or indeed stone in some cases. And of course, these bricks are hidden beneath many, many decades of paint. So what we think of, therefore, as being Victorian fabric of the buildings isn't really quite what we see. It's a bit more complicated than that. But we do see traces of Victorian and indeed post-Victorian history in these buildings, largely in the brickwork itself. So we see scars in the brickwork where candle alcoves, which is what you can see on this picture here, have been bricked up, filled up and painted over. We see bricked up doorways, expanded windows, joining obviously of new extensions onto the older the buildings and so on. And all of this can be read, and is read indeed, by the people who live and work in these buildings as a sense of the age of them, a sense of being aware of how they've changed through time. In terms of how they function now, both for the prison system as a whole and individually, as Andrea said already, they are largely local Cat B prisons. They hold just men, which means that they serve this interesting function of serving the local courts, largely, although not completely, short sentence prisoners and prisoners who are being resettled. The conditions in them, very clearly, differ significantly from the newer prisons which we also have. They have much, much less modern sanitation and plumbing and so on, and they have less in-cell technology. They're largely quite tight urban sites. These prisons weren't initially built in town. Of course, towns have expanded to sort of encompass them through time, but they are on quite tight sites with limits therefore on the amount of space that there is to build new things, to enable workshops and sports and so on to take place. The internal layout tends to have limited spaces for staff. And if you want to have an on-wing office or sort of workspace of any kind, you have to convert cells into them. So there's a lot of people, in a nutshell, on a really small footprint, which has implications, therefore, for the kind of things which can take place in them, and indeed the living conditions. This means that in these prisons, when people are unlocked, and we observe this and we're told lots about it on site, there's a lot of interaction. So lots of staff are out on the wings and they're in conversation with the people they are looking after. There's a lot of things that they have to deal with, given the sorts of populations that are in these prisons and the kind of challenges they're facing. Perhaps they're on trial, they're waiting for sentencing, or they're waiting to be resettled. So there's a lot of challenges for staff. And because of the relative lack of in-cell technology and sometimes absence of kiosks as well, there's a much more paper-based system than there can be at some newer prisons. And indeed, many people talk to us about kind of going back to doing things on paper as being a sort of a sense of the age of these prisons, of in a way, stepping back in time. There is a sense of interaction of the function and design, and we were told a number of times about Victorian prisons almost acting as a fast track development for staff, because they see everything and have to deal with everything in the absence of a more sort of computerized system, which has its plus points, but of course also has its risks if staff feel overwhelmed and overworked and can't cope with the volume of things that they have to do. In terms of how it feels to live and to work in these prisons, I think, you know, Lee will perhaps talk to us lots on this topic, but our sense from our research was that there's a very strong feeling from people who live and work in them about an awareness of age, an awareness of the old and the new being side by side, and a sense of, as you can see in these two quotes, both the juxtaposition of very, very modern trappings of life alongside these really old brick buildings, and to some extent a sense that these buildings really haven't changed that much through time, and a really strong sense of connection with the lives that have been led in these prisons in the past, both on the part of those who are being held in them and staff who work there. We also found a real sense of fascination with age and really intriguing understandings of the age of these buildings. Clearly, given the history of these buildings and the things which have happened in them, there's a lot of interest in the location of the hanging cells, where the people who'd been hung at these prisons were buried and so on. There's a lot of talk of ghost stories and hauntings, both actual ghosts that people reported that they'd seen, but more a sense of awareness of all the other previous lives that have been led in these buildings, those who've walked the landings before me and so on. And also a really strong sense of connection to local and to family history, given the policy of these prisons. And I suppose a sense in general that given how long they've been operating, a really large number of lives have somehow seeped into the brick. As I said, I won't speak very much on this topic around the cultural framing, but we heard a lot about the ways in which Victorian prisons are represented on TV and in film and so on. And porridge, as you would imagine, came up over and over again. I suppose the key thing here is that really, because these prisons have operated for so long, they're a key cultural reference point for what prison in the UK looks like. They really strongly, we think, shape the impressions that people who don't have experience of them have about what prison is like. And we think that's a significant thing, but again, perhaps that's something to get into more in the Q&A. So let's finish up by talking a bit about the fallout and what it means to continue to operate the Victorian estate now. So we think, based on our research, that their continued operation has significant effects. So as far as we can see, the familiarity with design means that staffing and management practices, which have obviously been shaped by and for these buildings over a really long time, those kind of stick, right? And perhaps that means that it's quite hard to move away from this design because of the ways in which we need staffing and management practices to be replicated to an extent across the estate. And I suppose it's difficult to imagine prisons different from how we know them to be. And a wider research interest of mine is in why we build the prisons that we do. And I think there's a significant sort of overhang of attachment to the Victorian radial hub spoke design of how prisons ought to be. And this is borne out really if we look at how over recent years we've built new prisons, as Roland Carthouse has said, kind of in the Victorian hub spoke galleried design, albeit now in concrete, of course, with showers and toilets and cells and so on. Going beyond that, though, what the implications are, I suppose, is that these prisons, where they're still in operation, are operating above their intended capacity. So as I've said already, they were intended to have one person per cell, but they've been doing this for some time. So as I said already as well, almost as soon as these prisons were opened, they were crowded. We had 2 or 3 people in these cells. And of course, they're experiencing now quite diverse standards of living right across the estate, from our newest prisons to our oldest. The conditions of life, as I'm sure that Lee will say, vary. The fact that these Victorian prisons are really robust buildings and that they're still standing despite their age is, I think, significant. We might to an extent be trapped by the durability of these buildings. They aren't going to fall down on their own, and they are arguably the most secure places in the estate. So they perform a function by definition, I suppose, of still being there because we still use them. We kind of still need to. In terms of where they are, I said already that they're tight urban sites, which are quite densely populated. It's difficult to let such sites go. They're close to cities, communities, prisoners, families, and so on. And we'd find it very, very challenging indeed to build like for like, by which I mean the same number of places in a site as small and as close to town. So for many people who we spoke to and asked a question about, would you rather be here in these living conditions or further from home, but in somewhere better, that was a quite challenging question to answer. And we were surprised by how often people would stay where they were as opposed to moving to a newer jail. So the continued operation, I suppose, of these prisons means that the rest of the estate can be different from them, which arguably makes the Victorian estate indispensable. Although, that's clearly a live debate. And of course, there's the huge cost of refurbishing these prisons, given the nature of the buildings. I'm sure that's something that we'll speak more about. And of course, the very practical limitations on what we can feasibly do with them. So to sum up, and I've gone a bit over time, for which apologies, these prisons have been built to last, and they have lasted. They're still robust and sturdy despite the challenges of maintaining them. The sheer longevity that they've had means that they have trained and they have influenced countless generations of people who've passed through their doors in various ways. And I think that has significant implications for how the prison estate will develop and change in the future. The sheer obduracy of these sites may serve to complicate operational change throughout the estate, but it's also interesting to consider the ways in which it encourages creativity. If a building is quite difficult to change, you have to think of ways around it, and you have to come up with quite innovative management practices to be able to allow a prison to do what you want it to do in those walls. But of course, there is continual tension in terms of the policy decisions which have to be made around continually refurbishing these prisons at great expense or closing them. And then, of course, about what kind of buildings ought to replace them, if at all, and where they should be. I'll stop there because I've gone over time. Thanks a lot for your time, and I look forward to hearing from Ian and from Lee.
Thanks, Dominique. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm afraid behind the scenes, we did lose one of our speakers, possibly because he's coming to us live from the Victorian building. But we'll go now to Ian Blakeman at Pentonville. Ian, can you unmute yourself and give us
Absolutely. Hi, and sorry about the disaster there with the with the technology there. All the internet went off in the prison all at the same time. Can you hear me there?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, excellent. Yes. So yes, yeah, back online now. So obviously I missed that presentation, but luckily I'd had a chance to view it beforehand. And yeah, is there anything in particular you wanted me to say on it, or do you want me to introduce myself to start with, Andrew?
Yeah, introduce yourself. Tell us about your experiences of Victorian prisons. I'm guessing Pentonville's not your first.
No, it's not. No, so yeah, Ian Blakeman, Governor of Pentonville. I've been here now about 3.5 years. I've been governing for 12 years now, and most of that time has been spent either at Pentonville or at Bedford, which you know, two of probably the best examples of Victorian jails. I also started my career at Aylesbury as a prison officer there, so yeah, fairly extensive experience of working in prisons like this. And I have to say, I quite like them. I think that there's certain aspects that come with working in a Victorian jail. I mean, the lines of sight, the observation, the ability to see most of your population, your staff group, your prisoner population easily is probably far easier than in my experience of governing a place like Bullingdon, where it might take you 2 days to get round, you know, and see everyone and see every aspect of it. There's an intrinsic bit of pride that comes from working in some of these older jails as well. So there's some of the culture rubs off on the staff in a good way. They're the good bits of working in a Victorian jail. But we face, you know, tremendous challenges around infrastructure. The fact that the place, my time is not necessarily spent focusing solely on rehabilitative outcomes. A lot of the time it's focused on making sure there's enough hot water going up to the fives, making sure the heating works in winter, making sure the pests are under control, And I don't always succeed in that. So yeah, a lot of experience and good and bad views of it.
Great. And Lee, how about you? What was your experience on the other side of the gate?
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Ian and Dominique. My experience involved 4 months spent in HMP Wandsworth in 2018. It's quite a unique experience in the sense that it just had a refurbishment. So I had a bit of a false impression in the sense that I had an ensuite toilet, which was kind of pleasant compared to what many people in prisons experience. But otherwise, it's an extremely gloomy looking building for sure. All sorts of plumbing issues, as Ian alluded to and Dominique did in her presentation. Really, generally, Victorian prisons, in my experience, have a pretty bad regime involving being locked in a cell for 23 hours a day, 24 at weekends. Food quality is normally not great at all. I also spent 2 months at HMP Brixton as well, which is actually older than Victorian. It's actually Georgian. And at Brixton, my experience was that the cells were exceptionally cramped. A bit of a trigger warning for being a bit graphic, but to just set the scene, you could be sharing a cell with someone and they're using the toilet and you're lying in bed. If you was to reach your arm across, you could touch their leg while they're using the toilet, just to give you an idea of how cramped the condition can be. Generally, also, I found that my experience of these particular 2 prisons is that there's much less going on in terms of ability to offer regime activities. I think showers and plumbing is definitely a big thing that comes up quite a lot. And it's interesting that Dominic mentioned it and Ian did as well. It's definitely a huge problem. But that's background to my experience.
Beyond plumbing, Ian, and how you spend your time, I mean, to what extent do you think, Dominique should come in with any questions as well. I mean, what extent do you feel like the footprint and the building itself facilitates or is an obstacle towards kind of reaching rehabilitative goals? And
yeah, I mean, I suppose that, the biggest contrast I have from being the governor of Bullingdon is my lack of activity space. It's the lack of meaningful workshop classroom space to send people to. So we tend to be really resourceful in prisons like this, that anything that could possibly be converted into a classroom or an activity area is. But that, my experience being the governor of Bullingdon, I had £1 million laundry there, of which people could learn proper laundry skills and went on into that industry, and there was a lot of employment links. I'm struggling a bit here in order to find the right environment. I think you've also got some real limitations as well around security in a prison like this. I think probably Bedford, Bedford was it's a proper town centre jail where you had a dentist surgery, the roof of it actually abutted the wall of the prison, and you'd have people climb up onto the roof with fishing rods hitting windows with packets of drugs. So you would have some real problems with throwovers in a way that I didn't get when I was a governor of Bullingdon or the deputy governor of Wayland, where people they'd have had to driven several miles to get there in the first place to throw stuff over the wall. So there are some real obstacles to running the regime that you want. But I think possibly going back to what I was saying earlier, it's the fact as the governor, my time isn't spent focusing necessarily. I mean, of course, I do spend a lot of time focusing on rehabilitative outcomes, but there's some. Each day might start off with a practical list of moans about things that aren't working, and I might be spending quite a bit of time each week talking to my independent monitoring board defending, or not defending, or trying to explain problems with infrastructure. And that's time I'm not spending on checking other things are working well, checking the courses are running, checking education attendance is up.
Yeah. And presumably when you get together with other governors of other London locals that are Victorians, they have similar problems.
They do, yeah. So I mean, I know that the last governor of Wandsworth was incredibly frustrated, around things like the windows were stuck open, so you'd have pigeons coming in all the time, and I think Pentonville has probably been slightly worse off than many other London locals because we didn't get investment in the same way. So if you think back to the 10 prisons project, Wormwood Scrubs were in that. Wandsworth was a reform prison, so quite a bit of additional funding came their way, so that they probably weren't quite as badly off as Pentonville. Pentonville, I think, probably until the last 2 or 3 years, suffered from a lack of investment for a long time. You can achieve quite a lot when you invest in it, but I suppose it's you're not hitting everything. You're only touching the sides. You're not even touching the sides, I suppose, with the amount that needs repairing here. We spend millions at Pentonville, and it will never be done.
Absolutely. I think you've put your finger on it, Ian, really, and in terms of how these old prisons are maintained today, there are significant challenges, and the challenges which come, as you were saying, about having the lack of space to do the kind of things that you'd like to, that's really a function of the fact that we're attempting to do a 21st century prison service with all the intentions that it has now, and buildings that were built for a different time, and when prisons were supposed to do something quite different, where we were intending people to stay most of the time in their cells and work in their cells. They weren't intended to have sort of provision in classrooms and so on. So we've over time moulded these prisons to do as good a job as the buildings can, I suppose, within the funding that we've had available for them and the different trends in government about how willing we are or aren't to spend on these prisons. And we're trying, I suppose, to do our best, as you said, in quite creative and innovative ways to make buildings do the things that we need them to. But as you said, in each case, they're all different. They have different thicknesses of wall, and of course that varies from one wing to the other. They have different kinds of doorways. It's just quite straightforward thing, like changing the door is very, very complicated because there's an iron fixing inside of the door frame to which the original door was fixed. So to get that out is a massive job. So everything is a much, much bigger job than we would think that it is, and of course all that comes with expense. I know these buildings, lots of people who work on them, we've spoken to lots of works teams or the AMI staff now who work in these prisons and maintain them. And on the one hand, they're frustrated by the challenges of trying to refurbish the prisons and install new things into them, but on the other are in awe of the craftsmanship which enabled people to build kind of curved brick ceilings in ways that they don't have the skills for now. So not saying that we should be doing this, but an enormous amount of effort went into building these buildings well to start with, and that's why they are still standing up. It also creates all sorts of challenges to how to maintain now, as you've said, it then takes your time away from the things that you also want to do. And we've seen all sorts of temporary boilers standing in yards with lots of pipes and wiring and so on going to them just to keep these buildings going. But if it is any comfort, the same challenges when we look at the governor's journals right back when these prisons opened, they were having the same challenges. How do we get any water at all up to the fives? How do we get these buildings warm at all? So these are unfortunately challenges that you're still facing.
Yeah.
Lee, can I ask how does it feel? I mean, Dominique's presentation talked about the kind of the ghosts and the idea that lots of people have been there before. I know you're ghosts because we do together. But that kind of folklore of old buildings, the fact that Ian's probably the 20th governor of the prison to be struggling with plumbing, like that kind of history, how does that affect your experience of jail, do you think?
I think it's definitely I think it's definitely a part of the problem, especially when it comes to the fact that we should want our prisons to be places that are rehabilitative, in my view, inspiring. I think when you've got an old building that's dark and dingy and dreary, just like Wandsworth is, I think that causes real harm when when you've got people that really you want to inspire to be the best version of themselves that they can possibly be. And then when you add on the extra effect of the problems with all of the infrastructure, and plumbing issues does seem to be a real recurring theme for sure, but those kind of issues, and I feel that really does hamper hugely what we want to achieve from incarceration in any form. I recognise that there are obviously people out there working in the prison system who want to make a good, positive difference, and I'm sure that these refurbishments like that happened at Wandsworth was with the best will of intentions in the world. But I know from correspondence that we've received at the Howard League from someone who was on the exact same wing that I was on in 2018, who reported, for example, not being able to get hot water for 87 days out of the 214 days that he was there. And when you're not delivering the basics like that, it's hard to properly achieve the real progressive change that we really should be achieving from our prisons.
Sorry, Ian, can I ask you a question? I know because Lee and I are visiting you in 10 days' time to have a look at it, but you've had this initiative of having a kind of neurodivergent friendly wing at Pentonville, and you've done that in a building that was obviously built and designed hundreds of years before autism was even a thing. So did that pose additional, does the infrastructure of the building pose additional challenges for something like the sort of progressive initiative like that?
I mean, it did. That unit in particular was a bit of a challenge because it's subterranean. I mean, it's our basement level. I mean, it has got light going into it, but you do get dampness problems. So in some respects, we wanted to make it our best accommodation, but because you've got 4 landings above, you can get every flood, every smash up can result that going through to the ones. And I think actually it shows what you can achieve if you put some investment into the unit. Actually, I say investment, we didn't spend a lot on it. We got prisoners to refurbish that for us largely. A lot of that's our own team that have done that. The bit we had to get some commitment from the centre was that we wouldn't increase the roll to its maximum capacity. So that's a unit where we'll hold 45 men maximum. It could hold 68. And I've got an agreement not to go above on the numbers. So I think, you can achieve quite a lot in a Victorian environment. But you can't overcrowd it. I think if I'd overcrowded it, I'd have lost what the unit was for. I'd have lost the real meaning of it. I've had to take some cells out of commission as well. So one of the cells is now our sensory room. So again, it's getting commitment of people above, not to overcrowd to its maximum extent. I mean, I suppose one of the reasons why we could actually do that is it got so bloody awful, we had to take it offline. My boss, for his first visit, when Ian Bickers came round, I took him down there just to show him how appalling some of the accommodation was. And by the end of the day, he'd taken the decision to take it out of commission. It was having that breathing space of a unit out of commission, us to put a bit of service investment, but mainly prisoner investment into getting it ready, and we could turn it round.
That's, if I can interject, that's really interesting to me, because I don't know the detail of the history at Pentonville, but at other prisons where there are 5 landings, the basement level, the ones, was never intended to be cells. So that was intended to be storage, but it was early on in the life of those prisons that the demand for space in them and the fact that they were already crowded or two'd up or three'd up meant that cells were expanded into those basement spaces, which the Victorians recognised when they built the prisons weren't fit to be lived in that way, for all the reasons that Ian said, because they are damp and perhaps dark and so on. So, you know, by the expansion of the accommodation prisons really early on, so not by, you know, this generation, but way beyond our living memory, we sort of land ourselves with all sorts of challenges around the accommodation and how to refurbish it. And it sounds as if what Ian's managed to do there is a really significant change.
Dominic, can I ask you a question? Only because I know it's something that's of concern to Ian, is what were Victorians like when it came to double bunking? I mean, were cells intended for a single person, 2 people, 3 people?
The prisons were built for one person per cell. What we know from looking at the archives from Liverpool, which had an extensive women's site, so almost half of the prison was built to accommodate women. I mean, it's the same. The buildings are the same, but it's essentially 2 prisons in one. Early on, when the population of the city, which was of course expanding during the Victorian period, the port and so on, and all the things which went along with that, the prison was really, really quickly crowded, and it was intended that there would be a maximum 3 men per 1 cell and 2 women per cell, and they also had temporary dormitories as well, but of course they had a lot more than that in them. It was thought that it was safe for men to be in 3s, women to be in 2s, and you know, perhaps we can guess why that might be. And of course we had 3 people in a Victorian-era cell right up to the 80s. So we have had, you know, a significant number of people in these cells in the past, but I suppose the key thing is that they were intended for 1 person, and lots of the challenges that Lee has talked about being really close to somebody else when they're on the toilet, and things which we've heard lots about in our research, and those concerns obviously don't go away completely because the cell is still small, but if you're not sharing those very intimate, private moments with somebody else, then the quality of life really in those cells is quite different. But of course that's common to shared cells across the estate, but I suppose the size of these cells being quite small and quite tight in many cases means that you do feel as if you're on top of one another.
I mean, some of the cells at Pentonville are really little, like with 23 size men in them. Lee?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point on when it comes to double bunking. I think it's important to say that there are times where I think it is really beneficial to be sharing a cell with someone from a perspective of mental health and still having some degree of social connection with someone. I think sometimes that can be really important to someone. I think where it does become a problem, and you touched on it at the end there, Dominique, is when it comes to using the toilet. I just think that doing something like using the toilet is something that feels, to me, incredibly inhumane and something that belongs in the past, to be doing that in front of someone else. And it just feels so, it always felt to me incredibly degrading. I know that we've made progress in the past in terms of the slopping out processes, so maybe things in the future will move in the right direction. But for me, using the toilet in the same room as someone else is something that should belong in the past.
Of course, one way to avoid doing that within the Victorian estate, and this is something that's happened in quite a few of these prisons, is that 3 cells have been made into 2, where the cell in between has been split into to make 2 separate toilet rooms, which are accessed each from the cell on the other side. And of course, that then reduces the number of people who can be held on that wing, but it does mean that the circumstances within the cells are different, and it also has the advantage that the toilets can be accessed and serviced from the landing, as opposed to having to go into the cell to fix whatever might be wrong, which is of course more common in the modern prisons. So there are ways of getting around this and dealing with the challenges which Lee has very eloquently described, but it does come with the implications for then how many spaces there are, and of course, you know, what life is like in that prison going forward.
And in the Q&A box, Sarah has noted that single cells aren't ubiquitous across the globe and aren't necessarily a good thing. In some places, they'd be considered to be cruel. So it's not quite as simple. So I guess perhaps more the quality of some of the cells that we put people in. We've got loads of questions already. Two, first of all, from Angela Kerwin, whose book I recommend to you all, Criminal. It came out last May, a year now. But lovely to see you here, Ange. Angela's first question is for you, Ian. She said, from my experience in PVI, there were real difficulties moving people around the prison to different activities. You have to go through one wing to get to healthcare, another to get to the library, especially with staff shortages. Are you finding it more difficult managing risks as staff movements because of the design of the building? And how do you manage risks like that in a building while facilitating activities?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a real challenge, because actually it's not just the design of the building that's a handicap with that, or a problem with that. It's the propensity for prisoners to fight with each other. So particularly people from different postcodes, different gangs, of which we have a particularly acute problem here, probably the most serious problem I've come across in prisons that I've worked in. So that's a big challenge. But one of the ways we've got around it, I suppose it's a lesson we've learned post-COVID, is we do less of it now. So what we do is there's more outreach, there's more activities geared up for certain wings. So if you're on D wing, for example, which is probably the furthest point from the education block, most of your education will be not in the education block. It will be based in based around your wing, or based in one of the activity areas around your wing. What we've also learned as well is, rather than just letting people, where people do mix, there's a lots of security clearance that goes into it. So the security department will vet pretty much every prisoner who's going to a different job. That means you have to staff it less in terms of the route. You don't have to invest so many staff in policing it, because we've already worked out, we've looked at the intelligence, and the risk of fighting is minimised. So the regime can always get handicapped at Pentonville due to a lack of staff, but by putting more investment in that sort of admin, security, intelligence bit, you have to resource it less.
Great. Another question from Ange is, and this you alluded to this, both of you, Ian and Dominique, is the fact that these are central kind of city jails, and the benefits that come from having our jails so close to the inner cities. When we're seeing prisons moving to more rural areas, what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages, I guess, for staff, for people in prison, for services, all that sort of stuff?
Shall I go firstly? Is that all right? So I think this is a really, really key question. I mean, I guess it's important to clarify that the Victorians didn't intend to build these prisons in city centres the way that they are now. When they were originally constructed, they were rural. They were on the edge of towns, in the same way that we build prisons in those kind of sites now. But of course, over time, those towns and cities have expanded and kind of enclosed those prisons. So now they have this urban character, which they didn't at the time. I mean, when Walton Prison was built to the north of Liverpool city centre, the road had to be extended to reach it. The road didn't go past the jail or site where it was constructed within fields when it was first built. But as you say, these are now urban sites, and they're very well connected, public transport and so on, and that of course has great advantages for visitation. And we know that receiving visits during incarceration is a really key factor for well-being and for reducing defending and for connection to children and families and so on, and that by placing prisons in more distant, rural locations, which perhaps make people rely more on cars, that places more challenges in the way of visiting. My sense, though, is that it's about land prices and the availability of large enough patches of land. So if we wanted to build now a prison that would hold as many people as are at Pentonville in an urban site comparable to Pentonville, it'd be extremely hard to find a plot of land, and it would be extortionate to buy it, and then of course to build something which would hold that many people in accommodation that we would now consider an appropriate type, which would be more spaced out, less dense on the site. So I suppose that's what I was getting at a bit in my presentation, that these prisons are now valuable. I don't mean financially, but they're valuable in terms of having those proximate locations to the communities from which prisoners might come, and which then facilitate their connection with home and family. And we have to weigh up, I suppose, that significant benefit against the benefit of improved living conditions, improved facilities, and all the things that Ian found that he could do at more modern prisons in the past, being able to do those things, but much further from where prisoners come to. So I realise I'm not giving you a straightforward answer to the question, but I think it's because it's a really challenging one of how do we balance these things out, and I suppose how do we make use of the Victorian estate in a way that we take advantage of that location for the critical points of a person's sentence, perhaps using them judiciously before moving people who are going to spend longer in prison to different prisons where perhaps their living conditions will be better, but then taking into account the fact that they will perhaps receive fewer visits during that time. So I suppose it's about sort of individual sentence planning and thinking about individual experiences, and trying then to square that with a prison system which is, of course, itself under pressure.
Is this, do you think, why we have so many remanded people in your prison, Ian, or at Scrubs, because of the proximity to?
I hadn't really thought of that. I suppose. I mean, we've got Crown Courts very near us. I suppose there is. I suppose that's something I saw as a real advantage, actually, just proximity to Crown Courts. There's something, there's a bit of advantage about getting people to and from fairly easily, from a place like Pentonville. There's also something very practical that when I'm potentially in trouble with the judges, I can just get on the tube to Wood Green, as opposed to, the Governor of Bullingdon, having to drive to Reading. Well, that took me a whole day, by the time I've gone to Reading, Crown Court and back. It might involve, a meeting at 5 o'clock in the evening or something. Whereas that's very, very easy for me to do here. So I think the closeness is helpful, particularly for the Crown Court relationship and the Magistrates Court relationship. I mean, Highbury Corner Magistrate is it's a 10-minute walk round the corner from here. So, and we've used that at times. And I can go to the cells at the courts at times. That's easy to do. I think the bit that an advantage I find to sort of like, the inner city or the town centre jail is something about the identity you can build amongst your staff group as well. There's a pride in being the most central, working at the most central London prison. When I was Governor of Bedford, people identified with the local town. They used to go and watch the local rugby team. There was quite a lot around being part of Bedford. Bedford as a wider community, your relationships with key stakeholders, which you probably didn't get when, I was Deputy Governor at Wayland. There was no one you really identified with. So I think that ability to build an identity is quite strong, and I definitely play on that here. I talk a lot at full staff meetings about the importance of keeping the streets of Islington safe and the role we play in that, the streets of Camden. We can identify with areas a mile from our door very easily.
Another question from the chat, this one perhaps for you, Lee. It says, within Victorian-era prisons, do you find this impacts on people's mental health whilst they're serving a sentence? Things such as layouts. Do you feel like that the architecture or the age of the building weighs on people?
I think it definitely does. I think when I first, when I arrived at Wandsworth, I'd never been in a prison before in my life, and I don't know if anyone listening in to this discussion has seen Wandsworth from the outside, but it's not a pretty picture, and it does look quite a daunting, dismal place. And certainly at that point, I didn't know how long I was going to be spending there or anything. And yeah, I think certainly seeing something that looks so uninspiring definitely can impact on mental health, for sure, without a doubt. I think there are certainly ways in which we can make prisons more, if we can make them look better in terms of more places that could inspire more a more positive future. That I feel like that's kind of a direction in which we should want to put prisons in. But ultimately, the other point I want to add to what Dominique and Ian was just saying to the previous question is, I don't think that moving everyone out of Victorian prisons and sending everyone off to brand new prisons out in rural areas is the answer either. I think ultimately the most important thing that we could be doing, or the government could be doing, is to focus on reducing the amount of people that we send to prison. And then that would be, I feel, the best way that we can make all prisons function better for their ultimate aim, which should be to make our streets safer, reduce recidivism, and inspire the people within them to be the best people that they can possibly be.
There are two questions from Jonathan. I think they're sort of related, Jonathan. Dominic, maybe you're in a position to answer them, about whether there are established criteria for, oh gosh, we've now gone a deep, long lens with Ian, and we're back. And maybe Ian knows the answer to this, is whether there are established criteria for kind of the end of life. Like, what is the palliative care plan for Victorian prisons, Dominique? Surely something you've been asked before. You know, given that demand is outstripping supply of prison places, it seems unlikely that it's immediate closure. It's obviously what we'd like to see at the Howard League is retirement of some of these buildings. Is there a plan, a strategy?
So I don't think it's quite as straightforward as that. So there have been various policy changes back and forth over time. We've seen various successive governments promised to close the Victorian estate, and then I think looked at the difficulties of doing so and the realities of doing that and what it would mean both in the long and short term, and rode back a degree from that. We know actually that some of the outcomes from some of the Victorian era prisons are good. You know, they are sometimes the statistics demonstrate that the things that we would want to be seeing happening within prisons are taking place. I'm reminded of the closure of HMP Shrewsbury, which was largely on grounds of cost, of how expensive it was to keep that prison, which was quite small, operating, even though it was doing well. So I think there's lots of sort of factors to weigh up here, and my sense is that it's as much about the individual establishment and the cost of operating it and the challenges that it individually has, as it is about what else would replace it and what the practicalities are there. So the cost of building new, and then of course there's the question of what should we build new, how different should it be, where should it be, and so on. So I don't think that there's a sort of tick box list of once it's doing this, this and this, then it's time to close it. And I suppose if there was such a thing, then it would be quite restrictive for policy makers to have flexibility around what they want the prison estate to do. So I can understand why that's not there. And indeed, lots of people who we spoke to who have lots of experience of these prisons said quite similar things to Ian's opening comments, that actually they're very they have quite a positive view about the ways in which these Victorian-era prisons can operate, the strength of the sightlines especially, which of course we see replicated in our more modern prisons, and indeed where those sightlines are not in place, we see quite a lot of challenges in those newer prisons, but ones which we've closed sooner because they weren't operating well and have sort of blind corners and so on, which caused all kinds of challenges. So I think this is a really complicated question, and I'm glad it's not my call to have to decide what to do with these prisons, because they definitely have strengths and they have challenges as well. So, you know, I suspect there's a lot of politics involved too about what you know, as we know, the challenges that face the justice system are several and complex, and they can't be solved quickly. So for various governments seeking re-election, it's about kind of what messages can we send, and of course building new and very expensive prisons is not a particularly appealing electoral move, you know. So there's lots going on here, which I think all whirls around those questions about for how much longer should we continue to use the Victorian estate as we do.
There's an interesting comment here from Charlotte, commenting on the parallel between mental health units and redesign, reapplication of them, which I think is obviously an interesting analogy. We're running out of time very quickly, as always happens when you get to these things. Let's find another question. There was one, oh gosh, sorry, I'm just having trouble going up this page. God, sorry. Here we go. What architectural aspects of the Victorian prisons would you consider worth keeping or expanding for future prisons, Ian? What would you take from your prison into your dream prison? In fact, there was another question also about the kind of Five Wells, Fossway, progressive prisons and the comparisons between the two. I'm not sure if you've had the benefit of seeing any of those, but when you look at your prison, what do you like compared to this?
So I think that the line I said earlier, the lines of sight. I mean, the observation. If I compare, you know, my experience of working in places like Wayland, Bullingdon, the Mount, where you've got dog legs, where you can't see round corners. So there's something about safety there. So I like the gallery landings, the bright and airiness which you can get from above. I think it's important to keep that. Also, the lack of office space, whilst that comes with it, there's a health warning with that. It does force staff out onto landings. It does force prison officers out onto landings, and you get more interaction as a result. If you get wings where there's too much in the way of, you know, staff can be based doing their administrative tasks off the landing, you tend to have more distance between staff and prisoners. So if I was going to design a dream prison, and I wouldn't design one in the middle of Islington, you know, you would design it somewhere else, probably away from where we are now, but you would definitely have staff out on the landings, or somewhere you bring the office out onto the wings, so you could have more interaction.
If I can jump in, I think we had similar. So that's a question that we asked of everyone who we spoke to in relation to this project, and they said really similar things. I think I mentioned it in the presentation, but perhaps because your connection dropped, Ian. But we found lots of people talking about the Victorian era prisons as almost a fast track for staff, because of the need to be out on wings means that they're in conversation all the time, learning about every different stage of people's sentences, especially because of the function that many of these prisons serve, both doing the end and the start, and in many cases all of everything in between for people, and because there's less opportunity for people to take responsibility for organising bits of their own sentence, perhaps because there's less in-cell technology or there's less kiosks, having to do things on paper, which of course is slow and frustrating, but it means that staff have to understand how all of those systems work, because they're going to get asked questions like why has my app about this not been done. So they learn really, really quickly about all aspects of prison sentences and the lives of people who are serving them. So that obviously comes with its benefits, as you said, but it also comes with its challenges where staff don't have the time to answer those questions well, of course, which then causes problems for the people they are caring for. But I think the design of the buildings and then the way that they're staffed has the opportunity to develop prison staff really well, where it's well managed.
Lee, is there anything you would take from a Victorian prison into the rest of the estate?
There is actually. If I compare Victorian prisons to non-Victorian prisons, and it's a bit of a generalisation, but and I don't know if it's an inner city thing. I don't know, but I feel that sometimes staff, as a general rule, in my experience, had a tendency to be a bit more progressive, I suppose it would be the best word to use. And I think at a time when there's it's becoming more and more difficult for the prison system to retain good staff, I think that the good staff is a really important element to retain, and they're essential to the rehabilitation of individuals within prisons.
We've also heard a number of comments in the Q&A around, why are we having these conversations at all so many years after Lord Wolfe told us that we should be downsizing, localising, all of those sort of things. And that's obviously something that the Howard League is picking up in our upcoming strategy. So we couldn't agree more with you. I think there's also a comment in there saying that there is something beautiful about the buildings. And I think that is right. Whenever I go to a Victorian, I walk into them, there is a sense of, it's much like going to the Royal Courts of Justice, a sense of grandeur and beauty. Unfortunately, it then tends to be a little bit decayed and there are buckets everywhere. But there is, I think, for those of us who get to leave quickly, there is something quite special about visiting them. Although I'm then very conscious of the fact that they're often exactly the same prisons that my forebears 150 years ago were in before they got transported. So not much in some ways has changed. I think that brings us to the end of today's session. My huge thanks to Dominic, Ian and Lee. This Zoom format means that you can't clap them, so I will. My thanks to all three of you. And thank you for sharing your experiences and your insights, in your case, your research, Dominique. Next week, I'm going to HMP Liverpool, and I'm also going to Five Wells. So I will be going in with new eyes into Liverpool, literally looking for buildings being plastered over, and then look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks in Pentonville. Please, thank you for the three of you for joining us today. Thank you for those people who've joined us from the audience and those of you who are watching online later. As Katie's put into the chat, please, if you're not a member of the Howard League, please do join us or join our mailing list. Our next event is on the history of John Howard and the Howard League, which is Jess Kebbell and Ferguson McNeil, who's the chair of our board, who has written some beautiful letters to John Howard that are part of the Talking Monuments project. Not what it's called, 50 Monuments Talking, I think it's called. But they're three beautiful letters to John Howard. And it's really a reflection on how prisons have come, far prisons have come since he was walking out of Bedford 250 years ago this year. And that event will be on the 13th of June in the early evening. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to everybody for giving up their lunchtime, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a good day.